It all started with one fateful meeting. The girl was sitting in her office, drinking afternoon tea as usual. Just then, suddenly a maid came running into her room and started shouting to tell her that Sir Elliot had arrived. The girl immediately set her teacup on the table, back down, for this news surprised her greatly. She hadn't expected Lucius to arrive. She didn't think a man could just show up at their door like that without any warning. But the maid said it was right. He replied that he was passing by and had already greeted the master, so should now go to the greenhouse. The girl asked that the maid tell him to wait, for she had to pack. However, the maid said that it was because he had urgent business to attend to, so he would like to meet right now. She explained that Sir Elliot had also asked all the servants to leave, as he wished to speak to the girl alone. The lady had no choice but to agree to the proposal. She got up from her desk and, adjusting her dress, asked if he was definitely in the greenhouse. The maid, because she was very worried, didn't hear her question at first, and once she repeated it, she said that it was right. He had now gone to the greenhouse. As the lady went out of the door and was about to go to meet him, she heard the other servants talking. They were very surprised that Sir Elliot had come. They didn't think he'd show up like this. Suddenly it seemed to many that he would never set foot in the duchy. However, the maid's friend contradicted her and said that the service became the most precious night after saving the emperor in the war, so it's pretty obvious that he would drop by once in a while. Then they giggled and suggested that he must have come to get revenge on his ex. One of the maids said that in fact she would also get even with someone who could abandon a man like that. In fact, the duchy is not in a good place right now because of the suspicion that the rebellion started. Some even say that the heiress's second fiancé has gone missing, and the maids believe that this is just the most incredibly opportune moment to get revenge. Of course, they condemned what Duchess had done 6 years ago, because it could not be seen as a positive result. However, her friend objected and said that before, the two of them were fine, and now it's not good at all. The mistress walked on and tried not to pay attention to their words. But the last of their words had caught the girl's attention. They said that there was nothing to be done about it because everything had boomeranged back on their poor mistress. Before long, she finally did arrive at the greenhouse. However, when she looked around, she realized that he was not there yet, and she had come earlier. The girl was very nervous about this meeting with Elliot, for she did not know what he would say at the sight of her. She didn't know for sure if he would start blaming her for the past and laughing at her situation. Mistress assumed that she would probably hear only words of hatred, for she had not done very nicely to him. After a while, a man came into the greenhouse. However, the girl did not immediately notice him. She still had various doubts and thoughts in her head about what to say if the accusations and name-calling did come. However, when Elliot walked in, he immediately saw the girl. He smiled and asked her how long she had been waiting for him. He called her by her first name, Dedraish. The girl, hearing the familiar voice, immediately turned to look at him. She was incredibly beautiful, and the wind was blowing her hair in different directions. She smiled back at him and told him that it had been a long time since they'd seen each other. Elliot wondered, however, and asked what she was doing out there. Deodrash explained that she had been waiting for him for the time being, who didn't know where to put himself. Hearing those words, he suddenly laughed. And afterwards he said that he understood. She must be very uncomfortable right now. But in that case, he smiled and asked why they should go for a walk, to dispel the tense atmosphere. They decided to do just that. The man and the girl walked past the whole incredibly beautiful greenhouse, which had many different kinds of flowers. He suddenly stopped and crouched down to take a closer look at the rosebush, and asked if she'd had a good time all this time. The girl got a little embarrassed, and afterward said that if he meant 6 years after their separation, she wished normally, but at one point suddenly everything went downhill. Elliot pretended to be very surprised. Then he said he'd heard something about it, about her fiancé's death. When she heard those words, tears came to her eyes again. It was still hard for her to get over this trauma, so she lowered her head and said that his body had not been found yet. but she still didn't understand why everyone around her said he was dead, even though there was no confirmation of it. Elliot didn't look her in the eye. He picked one of the flowers and said that, in a way, it would still be better if the corpse was found. He said that it must be very hard to live with complicated hopes, and she had a very difficult time. He understood her feelings, and at that moment he smelled the rose he had just plucked. It was incredibly fragrant, and gave her soul hope. However, the girl was not so happy, as she did not understand from what he would understand, and in general, how he could say such words about her husband. At this point he began to rise from the floor and said that she should accept the marriage anyway. After all, everything was already agreed with her father. The girl replied that she knew it very well and that she had no right to refuse. At that moment, Daedrich remembered how emotional that conversation with her father had been. She had even started hitting the dishes out of anger. Her father asked her to calm down. However, the girl could not calm down because it angered her. She screamed and wondered if she was even sane. Her father asked how she could marry Luis, or had he already forgotten what he'd done to him 6 years ago. She said he was the reason the guy was unable to go out and face his own family, and she doesn't understand what marriage to her could even be talked about. Then the father began to shout. He asked what he had left in return for forgiving the attempted rebellion. The emperor ordered her to marry his prized knight. If they wanted to survive in this world, they would have to listen to the emperor. The girl, hearing that, realized that he was probably referring not to the two of them, but to himself alone. Daedrich was silent for a while. Then she said in a quiet voice that she was against it anyway, and if she explained everything to His Majesty, but her father interrupted her at once. He was silent for a while. Then he asked what she was going to explain to him. That passed when she and Elio were engaged there. So no way. Well, no way to deal with that situation. The man sighed heavily and said her position to marry him is certainly humiliating. However, whatever Elliot's background, everything changes if he is loved by the emperor. He also said that Elliot's essence was now much higher than that of a mere noble. However, the girl was still very angry and asked, "Does he really think that status and origin are important now?" Daedrich said she'd rather be the second wife of some brainless aristocrat, because she really doesn't want to put up with this shame and embarrassment and doesn't understand what it's all for at all. Her father got up from his seat and said that of course he understood what she would have to face once she was married, but she had to be patient for the sake of their family. Without waiting for her answer, he said that the conversation was over and asked her to leave. Daedrich wanted to object. She said she couldn't even look him in the eye. But her father told her to stop being stubborn. He started shouting at the girl again and said that she should not be hindered by some guilt. She must behave like an heiress of a duchy. Daedrich was surprised at her father's words and could no longer hold back her tears. He came closer and said that Elliot would soon come to them to make a marriage contract and asked her to make sure that he did not mention the past. He called her his favorite daughter and said that the fate of all the members of their family was now in her hands. The girl must not forget that she exists only because of the glory of the duchy. He kept telling her to behave as befitted an heiress, and the girl didn't understand how it could be for her sake, since he had also raised the rebellion, and now he was using his own child to fix the situation. Remembering all these moments, Daedrich said with a downcast look that she owed it to herself and agreed to this marriage. But then she turned to Elio and said that he could actually say no. The man replied that he didn't really have a choice in the matter either. He glimpsed a glimpse of her and smilingly said that marriage to her seemed to him an extremely tempting venture. They went on, and Elliot said that the emperor had wanted to give him a noble title all along, but the conservatives were against it because of his family's history. But in simple terms, he wants a connection to the girl's family. Daedrich now seemed to be beginning to realize what he was getting at. The guy said it was right. He just handed the document to her father. However, he thinks she already figured it out on her own. The girl wondered very much how he could even be so calm in such a situation, and assumed that he probably just didn't care. Lucius had lost everything because of them, and she couldn't understand why he was acting as if nothing had happened. Then suddenly Elliot stopped and looked at the girl and said that the only major condition was that he had one condition. Deirdre looked at him in surprise and asked, "What is this condition?" Then the man said that the emperor wanted their marriage to be for love. When the girl heard this, she was shocked. On the face of it, he told her to judge for herself. For it would do no good if people began to think that the emperor had forced him to marry her in order to bestow a title. The man said he knows about their past, so he wants to make it seem as if they met after all these years, and feelings flared up between them again. When he saw the misunderstanding on the girl's face, he said that was right. For everyone, they would have to pretend as if they had fallen in love with each other all over again and couldn't live at a distance. Deirdre protested anyway. She said it was all nonsense. After all, everyone knows how they broke up, and how they can pretend to fall in love all over again. Then her voice suddenly trembled, and she said that to top it all off, it had only been nothing since the news of her fiancé's death. But Lucius had said that a person's feelings were waves and wind, and she could consider that he had taken advantage of her grief-stricken moment. He looked at the girl carefully and asked if she thought it was that hard. After all, they were not the first or the last to do so. He also said that to top it all off, it would be easier for them to do it, because the fact that they loved each other is a known fact to everyone. The girl at that moment began to scrutinize his appearance. It was bright golden hair like the sun and ruby eyes that glittered in the sun. Deirdre remarked that Lucius hadn't changed a bit in 6 years, and their attitudes certainly had. At that moment, the guy suddenly smiled and said that in that case, he would like her to work on her facial expression, so she had some time before the ball that would be held very soon. He came close to her, and afterward kissed her hand, saying that if she appeared at the ball as frightened and confused as she was, people would hardly believe they were lovers. Then he shifted his gaze to the ring she had on her finger, and told her to remember to remove that ugly piece of jewelry as well. Deirdre, when she heard this, was very surprised by this reaction, and then remembered that she still wears her engagement ring. At that moment, she was incredibly angry, and couldn't even believe that she had come to meet her future fiancé without taking off the ring from her previous one. She had completely forgotten about that important detail because of Lucius. Despite all the awkwardness, the girl was glad that at least their first meeting after a long distance hadn't gone as badly as she had imagined it would. After that, the girl went to her bedroom and fell into a deep sleep. But then suddenly she began to dream about some situation that was very familiar. She was still very young, and then suddenly when she heard someone calling her, she turned around and saw Lucius and immediately ran to him to hug him. The boy was also very happy to see her, and to smell her pleasant scent of flowers. Deirdre asked where he had been all this time, for she had almost lost her mind while waiting for him. The man was surprised and asked if she was really that worried about him. Seeing her serious face, he said, laughing, that it turns out that she had been looking for him all this time. It was very nice of her. The girl laughed and said that of course it was, but then suddenly his voice became serious, and he said it was all a lie. He looked angrily at her and told the girl to stop lying to him, for after that day she never looked for him. Because of this terrible dream, Deirdre woke up in her bed. When she looked around, she realized that she was lying in her room, perfectly safe. The girl sat up to calm down a little, for her breathing was intermittent and very rapid. She realized that it was only a dream. In fact, since her recent encounter with Lucius, she had been having the same dream every day. Deirdre even suggested that perhaps it was because the day of the ball he'd mentioned was approaching. She thought about the phrase she'd heard in her dream, about how she'd never looked for him after that day. It made the girl feel even worse. She put her head in her knees and began to cry loudly. Deirdre was very tired of all this, but suddenly her emotions were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was a maid named Rosaline, and she asked if she could come in. The mistress quickly wiped her tears so she wouldn't notice and allowed the maid to enter. Rosaline opened the door, a tray with a letter in it. She wished her good morning and asked if she had slept well. When she saw the lady's face, she was very excited. Deirdre rubbed her head and wished her a good morning as well. However, she did not think it was a good morning. Zalin immediately became anxious and asked if she was well or not, for she was so pale. The maid did not wait for an answer, and immediately wanted to call a physician. Dedrache sighed heavily and told her not to do that, because she was just having a bad dream. Then she asked what she wanted. The maid gave her the letter and told her that Sir Elliot had sent her this. When the girl saw it, she was very surprised. She had not expected it to happen like this. Then she quickly opened the letter and began to read it to see what he wanted. But Dedrache did not like the contents. She even shrank back. And the maid, seeing her expression, became anxious and asked if there was anything wrong. But she replied that it was fine. And at that moment she herself clutched the piece of paper tightly, thinking about what she should just do and nothing more. And so from that moment a few more days passed, and finally came that long-awaited ball. The estate had everything incredibly beautifully decorated for the event, as well as the finest alcohol and hors d'oeuvres on display. Little by little already the guests began to gather in the hall. All the ladies were in incredibly beautiful and luxurious dresses, and the men in suits. But soon another very important guest arrived, and it was Sir Elliot. Father Dedrache came out at once to meet him. The man said hello, and said that he wasn't sure if someone like him had a place at an event like this. However, the girl's father asked him not to say that. He smiled, and said that Elliot is His Majesty's favorite after all, and without his presence, no one dares to be in this place at all. And he was also sure that His Majesty's Her Highness the Emperor's sister would be greatly pleased when she saw him. Elliot smiled his charming smile, thanking him for such nice words. Well then, the gentleman asked if he had heard the latest news. The man was surprised and asked what the news was. But the girl's father said that he knew so, and so knew that the lad had heard nothing. After that, he came closer to him and whispered that some people say that the heiress of the Duchy of Luiden will attend this ball. It wasn't him who said the last phrase, for the very same girl had indeed entered the room, and people immediately turned to look at her and began to discuss this appearance. People began to condemn her for being completely out of her mind. Her husband was dead, and she dares to even come to balls. One of the men thought it would have been better if she had come to Sir Fred's funeral. At that moment Dedrache appeared in the hall, dressed all in black, for she was in mourning, and despite the modesty of this outfit, she still looked incredibly beautiful. When the girl passed, she heard all their conversations, and thought that they were all so kind, chasing her away from the ball straight to the funeral. But on the other hand, remembering the note Elliot had sent her, she thought that since they'd talked about the funeral, it meant she was dressed exactly as Lucius had asked. When the girl walked a little farther, she saw him standing not far from her and smiling happily, raising his wineglass, giving her a sign that she had done the right thing. Dedrache, seeing his joyful face, thought that he was in a very good mood, you bet, because she had done exactly as he said, then even better. But at that moment the guests started to whisper. They also saw Elliot smiling at someone and didn't realize who. The ladies objected, and said they were asking the obvious things, for it was already clear that he was smiling at the Lady Berry spot. One of the guests said that rumors have started to swirl lately that the two have been having an affair, and judging by the smile, apparently that is indeed the case. The ladies were watching this very lady, and one of them said that somehow she was from a noble family, and Sir Elliot, whatever his feats, is still of low birth. And in the end, only marriage could save him from this terrible situation. Suddenly, the other friends hissed and said that they would hear her, and the girl immediately apologized and said that she had gotten a little carried away. Dedrache, who was standing not far from them and took her glass of alcohol, realized that the three of them had already managed to even compose an entire story with just one smile. In that case, if they say they've fallen in love again, the ground will probably crumble from under their feet, because things won't happen the way they expected. At this moment, the girl stood all alone and thought that now she would not mind going home and doing her own thing. They are uselessly at this ball, where the guests do not even respect each other. But suddenly, Dedrache heard the girls talking again. One of them asked him who he was going to marry this time. It seemed to be a matter of great interest to them, for they did not want to close the subject. Suddenly, one of the ladies objected and said to Lady Kepler that it was not right to express curiosity about such topics so openly. The girl smiled and said that she understood, but that it was all the same. When a young lady's wedding has already been upset twice, it's eerie to wonder who the next lucky guy will be. But on the other hand, they are right. Usually the family falls apart after the first failed marriage. But my lady is an extremely noble person and at one time was even considered the flower of social circles. Well, nowadays people are saying she probably won't even stand it and just go to the temple. But somehow, my lady is known for going there every Sunday. Lady Kepler says that's all true. However, she is not sure if she will leave society altogether, as there are still those special people who want to marry her. The girl laughed and said, "Our family has already lost the emperor's trust. So she has nothing else to do. Moreover, judging by the faces, everyone is just afraid of her." And the guests said that it was not for nothing after all, for one lost his reputation, and the other even lost his life because of it. Of course they were discussing Didrosh, and one of the girls said that no one knew for sure. Suddenly, there were still brave men who were willing to publicly confess their feelings to the lady, or at least secretly send her some letters. Lady Kepler, who had started this conversation on purpose, was glancing at Didrosh at the same time. In fact, she was very annoyed with her, so she was doing her best to humiliate Didrosh and make her take her place. She raised her voice on purpose at the loudest phrases so that the girl could hear. However, when she looked at Didrosh, all she saw was a sweet smile on her face. And when the lady saw it, she was incredibly surprised, and maybe even scared. She hadn't expected such a reaction from the girl, and didn't understand why she was smiling at all in such a situation. Suddenly their conversations and angry glances were interrupted by the voice of Madame Belle. She asked them to stop and wished them a good evening. The ladies immediately began to make excuses. They apologized in quiet voices and said that it wasn't what she thought and they didn't mean it at all. Didrosh, who had heard all this, was incredibly surprised. She could not believe that Dixie had really helped her, for they had parted so badly the last time they had met. Dixie was Elliot's brother, and the last time they met, she cried and screamed, telling Didrosh that she had never truly loved her brother. Didrosh didn't deny it. She thought the girl was quite right. Perhaps she was more concerned about her own feelings than Lucius's. At that moment, Dixie came up to Lady Barry and began to talk to her about something. The girl who was watching all this realized that the two of them were probably friends, though she didn't even know it. At that moment, Didrosh recalled the girl's phrase that there had been rumors lately about them having an affair together with Elliot, and she was surprised that he dared to charge her something for the engagement ring, even though he was spreading dirty rumors himself. And so, while the girl was thinking about it, a young man suddenly approached her from behind. He bowed and said hello to the lady. Didrosh looked at him in surprise and asked what was the matter, why he was coming up to her all of a sudden. The stranger replied that he would very much like to ask her to dance and asked if she would refuse him. When the girl heard this, she was very surprised. She didn't expect him to offer her to dance in such a situation. Also, this guy came so close that their foreheads could even touch if the girl leaned over. Didrosh didn't know how to get out of such a situation, but said that she didn't mind being there in principle. However, because of her, various bad and dirty rumors could be spread on him. But the boy took her by the waist to start dancing and said that whatever rumors were going around him, it was better that way than to disobey an order. When the girl heard this, she was very surprised and asked what order we were talking about. The stranger looked somewhere off to the side and told her to look there too. It was Lucius who was standing right where the two of them were looking, and she wondered if he was the one who had sent him. The man confirmed and twirled the girl in a dance, saying that the gentleman had personally ordered her to dance with him, and that he must be very anxious. Didrosh did not understand why he was suddenly anxious and inquired. The girl suddenly quoted Elliot's words that it was enough for her to do nothing to spoil a man's reputation, and asked if he had not said so. The man was very surprised and asked what she was talking about, but Didrosh immediately changed the subject to another conversation, and they continued to dance for a few more minutes. And when the music was over, the The girl thanked him for this beautiful dance and said that she was going to go. But just as she was about to do so, the man suddenly grabbed her arm. He looked very worried and even angry. Didresh looked at him in surprise. She didn't know what to do for a while. Then she asked him angrily what he was doing. However, the man at that moment handed her a piece of paper in her hand and whispered in her ear for her to open it in a deserted place. Didresh at that moment began to remember all those phrases the guests had said, and she felt uneasy. She looked at the little paper and laughed out loud. The girl didn't even think she'd live to see the moment when the groom's servant started flirting with her. The guy who had stayed by her side until now gave her a surprised look and asked if she was okay. But at that moment, Didresh did something that the man certainly didn't expect her to do. She took the paper and tore it into small pieces. And she thought to herself, did he really think she was an idiot? He suddenly started yelling loudly, asking what she had done and why she had torn up the note from Sir Elliot. It was obvious from his reaction that he was panicking and didn't know what to do. But when Didresh heard who the note was from, she made an innocent look and asked, is it really from Lucius? For that was not what she had thought at all. The guy even fell to his knees from his emotions. He said that actually, yes, the gentleman had just told him to ask her to dance to discreetly convey his message, and he in no way meant to be rude or laugh at her in any way. The boy almost cried because of what she had done, and said that the Lord would probably kill him, asking the mistress what they should do now. Didresh, who was still surprised that the message was indeed from Lucius, didn't know what to do. Soon they were out on the balcony, for the girl needed to talk to him. And when she said that she had torn up the note, she heard a loud and shrill laugh from Elliot. This laughter lasted long enough, for he was shocked, and said she certainly surprised him. The man sat at a table not far from her, and Didresh stood staring off into the distance. She was embarrassed because her cheeks were flushed. After a while, he said that now he understood why his friend had come to him in tears. But the girl didn't like how long he'd been blaming her. She said that she had come to meet him in the end, so she didn't think it was necessary to make a big deal out of it. This fellow had whispered to her, at the first opportunity, that she should come to the 3rd East Terrace, in order that he might not fall in the eyes of the master. And right now, as Didresh stood on the balcony of one of these terraces, she had not dared to look at her fiancé for some time. But soon she came closer to him, and told him that he actually could have delivered his message himself and not set up these strange machinations. Didresh was not happy from Lucius's actions. First he asked that she wear a funeral outfit, then he was handing over those strange secret notes. And last of all, he's also got a smackdown. A servant spy. She looked at him and thought he was just going along. She couldn't believe that for him it could be with something serious, and not just a game. They were silent for a while. After that, the girl asked him what he was going to do now. The boy looked at her in surprise, not understanding what she meant. Didresh, sighing heavily, explained that he'd asked her to come to the funeral parlor after all, and must have come up with some great plan. Since he had, the guy still didn't see where this was going to lean. And then the girl said it was probably the same plan where they were playing at love. Now, the one, Lucius, understood and said that they could just stand here together for a while, and the rumors would spread on their own, so they wouldn't even have to make any effort. He asked, smiling, why bother, and to think of anything at all if people are their own enemies. Didresh was angry because she was not very comfortable in this outfit, and she wondered why he had said to wear it in the first place, and then asked skeptically if he really just wanted to make fun of her. Lucius rose from his seat and calmly told her not to worry, for he did it for her good, and asked that she not misunderstand his request. He started to get closer to the girl and told her that she knows herself everywhere, that everyone is so eager to sling mud at her for absolutely anything, and if the girl showed up at the ball so dressed up, then everyone would immediately think that her goal is to turn his head. He looked at the girl for a while, and then, smiling, said that of course the most effective way to avoid slander was to wear that damned ring. However, he is still afraid that in such a case he would be turned inside out. Didresh didn't react to his words. They just stood there looking at each other. Then the girl finally gathered her thoughts and looked at him menacingly and said that she could see that his tongue was completely boneless and he was not going to think with his head. Lucius was a little surprised at such a phrase from the girl and was flustered for a while. And after that, he fixed his golden hair with his hand and smiled and said that she was right, because he had been at the front for 6 years. Then he became more serious and said that the girl hadn't changed at all, but maybe she was a little more boring than she used to be. Who, without waiting for her answer, Face said that it was quite understandable. When you marry a pompous moralist, in time you naturally begin to be like him. Deirdre was a little hurt by these words, but she said nothing. The girl thought about the fact that the marriage with Fred was also a marriage of convenience, as it was with Elliot now, but she can't say that she had any feelings for him. However, it still makes the girl uncomfortable when he says that. Deirdre, after a few moments of silence, asked him not to speak that way about Freddie. After all, he had lost his life because of her father, so she didn't want to hear any insults directed at him. The guy, when he heard this, was very surprised. He didn't even say anything back to her. Deirdre realized now that she'd said all that for nothing, because Lucius had looked unhappy when she'd talked about her and Fred's engagement. And now what he might say to her was frightening. But to her surprise, Lucius had already suddenly apologized and said that she was right, because he had really overdone it. The guy was really sorry for making such a comment about him. The girl was very surprised. However, she said that there was nothing wrong with it, and she couldn't believe that he had just apologized. She actually thought he would get angry or make fun of her situation. But Deirdre decided not to get her hopes up too high and assumed he was probably just in a good mood right now. After a brief silence, he suddenly wondered if she had felt something similar toward him once. The girl didn't understand what he was talking about at first. Then Elliot explained that he wondered if she had felt something similar to the way she had defended Fred from judgment, if she had guilt and compassion. Deirdre was a little surprised by this question, so she remained silent for a while. Then the man spoke, asking if she had felt anything since she had left him 6 years ago. The next day, a lady suddenly came to meet the girl and started asking about Bella Anis. Deirdre was very surprised, and the woman said that as far as she knew, she was now in the duchy. The girl confirmed this information and asked in surprise how she could possibly know it at all. But the woman did not answer that question. She took her cup of tea and said that she had come to warn Madame about something, and said that this woman was extremely suspicious in her opinion. Saying these words, she looked very excited and serious at the same time. She said that it was the very unknown Bella Anis who showed up at their door, saying she wanted to meet Lucius in person. Bella was very angry and could not restrain herself, even tried to break out of the hands of the guard. She wanted to meet him so badly. Of course, Lucius's mistress and mother thought she was very strange, so they asked her to just leave. However, the girl had no idea that she would now be living on the estate at Deirdre's. The girl said that she was absolutely certain that Anya had deliberately entered the duchy's trust in order to get close to Lucius, so we need to chase her away as soon as possible. Deirdre, hearing all this, turned indignantly to Dixie, asking what on earth she was saying, for it was all wrong, and Madame Anissa had come to them herself. The girl, smiling, said that she had lost everything in the hosta and was wounded on top of that. The ducal carriage had accidentally hit her, and her father, after listening to the woman's story, had allowed her to stay with them. So she smiled at Dixie and said she had nothing to worry about. She was about to say something when she suddenly realized that she had better not, and with a heavy sigh, the girl said she was quite right. Perhaps Dixie was really just overreacting to the incident. However, still, some misgiving did not leave her. So Dixie took Deirdre's hands and told her that if anything happened, she would ask her to keep Lucius safe. She looked her straight in the eye and asked her to make her a promise. Deirdre was a little surprised, but promised anyway. In fact, in the girl's opinion, Dixie was really exaggerating. After all, Lucius was really acting as usual. If something had happened, she was sure he would have been the first to tell her. All the more, Deirdre realized that her father did not approve of their relationship. At that moment, the girl suddenly stepped out into the corridor and passed by the open door. She caught a glimpse of someone talking. So when she looked in, she saw her father and Madame Anisse there. Deirdre was about to do something, but then she stopped herself. She knew she must not make him angry, or she would be severely punished. So she really hoped that nothing would happen, and even if something did happen, he would be responsible for it. Deirdre reassured herself by saying that everything would be all right. That's exactly what the girl thought until one day 6 years ago, when what happened. When people looked at their couple, they always admired them. Many people were very curious about how they met and found each other in the first place. Others, however, said that in social circles, they were now the talk of the town. Many were also jealous of such popularity. However, there was one obstacle in their way, and that obstacle was Madame Anise. One day, when the boy and the girl were at an event, she suddenly burst into the room with tears in her eyes and started saying something to Lucius. Deirdre already tried to calm her down and drive her away from her fiancé, when suddenly they cried even more and said in a joyful voice that they were finally able to meet. She also apologized to Elliot for not coming to see him for so long. She called herself his worthless mother and called him her son. This was a great surprise to the girl. Deirdre looked at her fiancé in surprise, asking what all this could mean. The other guests present were also shocked. They didn't understand what this woman was even talking about. After all, the gentleman's mother was a countess. Others assumed that she was probably just mistaken. Madame Anise suddenly began to wipe her tears from her face and said he was her poor boy, and it was understandable that he didn't remember because he was just a baby then. The girl said her name, and then she turned to the guests who were talking about her and began to say loudly that she had belonged to a noble family from Hast long ago. Fate had brought her together with a sailor officer. This officer promised to marry her, and she, hoping, bore a child for him, for he dreamed of it so much. However, it wasn't what she expected, and as it turned out, he already had a spouse in Alona. 6 years ago, a former lover began to ask for the baby to be given to him, because his wife was unable to bear him a child. He even offered to exchange his son for his fortune. Because the girl got pregnant out of wedlock, her family kicked her out the door as an unwanted item. There was therefore nothing left for Madame Anise but to accept the offer for the welfare of the child. At first, the former lover even sent her portraits of her son from time to time, so that she could see how he was growing up. However, after a while, all ties between them were severed. He was going to take the baby away from her forever. Madame Anise suddenly began to cry again and said that for the child's well-being, she had endured all this time. But she wanted to see her son at least once before she died. Suddenly, one of the guests became indignant and asked what this nonsense was all about. She says on what grounds she can even claim such things, for Count Fenry is not at all the man she says he is. The guest was very worried about the reputation of this family, so she asked that the woman stop lying already, but the lady replied in a calm and cold voice that she wasn't actually lying. After that, she took out some small thing from her dress pocket and said that she had proof. At that moment she revealed a piece of jewelry, inside of which was a photograph of a little yellow-haired boy, and the girl said it was a portrait that her son's father had sent. When the ladies saw it, they were very much surprised, for it was indeed Mr. Elliot. Then they suddenly thought about it and realized that before receiving his current title, the Count had served near Hasta, where Madame Anise was from. But the others objected and said that because of the fever he could not speak now, and that Mr. Elliot must not have known anything, for he was still a child. But she did not understand why the Countess had not told him before. The other guest objected, and said that Madame might not have known about it either. Otherwise, she would not have been idle. When Deirdre found out about it, she was very surprised. She realized that Lucius was an illegitimate child. But the girl could not believe it, and denied these facts in her head. After all, everything is just on emotions it cannot be. She decided to ask her father for help. But when Deirdre was about to approach him, she saw the absolutely calm, emotionless face of her father, who was watching the whole thing. The girl was very surprised. She did not understand why he just sat there and did nothing. It was then that Deirdre guessed that Madame, after all, had almost been injured by their carriage, and she had come from Hasta. The girl realized that her father would not allow her marriage to Lucius and asked that Madame be kept an eye on while blackening his reputation. But then suddenly someone turned to Mr. Elliot and asked him to quickly answer whether this woman was really his own mother. The guy didn't know what to do. Out of grief, he looked at his lover, looking for some support in her eyes. Dixie really hoped that he wouldn't think badly of her, because that wasn't the case at all. Her father didn't say anything to her. Then she saw the disappointment in Lucius's eyes. And in fact, the girl's memories cut off at that very moment, even though she hadn't lost her consciousness. The only thing left in her memory was that moment, and nothing else. Lucius then replied that he unfortunately did not remember if the woman was his mother or not. However, he confirmed the fact that he really didn't live in the county until he was 6 years old. And so after Lucius's answer, people accepted Madame Anice's words as the truth and realized that he must indeed be an illegitimate child. And so sometime after that, in the chaos, Lucius was even taken to court, eventually being stripped of the title of heir and the Fenry surname he used to possess. And so, having lost everything, Lucius Fenry became Lucius Elliot and was forcibly sent to war. And now, as the two of them stand together on the veranda, he wonders if she really had that feeling of guilt and compassion for him as she had for Fred. Lucius looked her straight in the eye and said that after she left him 6 years ago, but then changed his mind and didn't ask her the question he wanted to. He smiled and asked that the girl just not say anything. But in fact, while waiting for the trial, Lucius came to her. Once, he begged to run away with him. However, their verbal altercation did not lead to anything good. He kept begging her to leave with him because he loved her more than anything else in the world. Then suddenly Lucius asked if she had practiced her facial expressions during this time. The girl was very surprised, but said that she hadn't. The guy said that was for the best. In fact, he thought it would probably be better for her to cry. Dixie was very surprised to hear this and asked what she needed to cry for. Then the guy explained that she would have to run away from this place, all in tears, and let him fix her hair a little. At that moment, he came closer and wanted to touch her hair, waiting for her consent. She nodded to him gently, and in that moment, his gentle touch brought back feelings and memories she had experienced before. That passionate look they had, and the joyous laughs that resounded almost throughout the entire estate. But what she missed most of all were those affectionate touches that gave her warmth for the rest of the day. And now, from his touch, every detail came back to her memory, and the girl felt embarrassed. At that moment, Lucius took and unraveled her hair a bit counterintuitively, in order to make it look like she was excited. Then he smiled as he examined his work and said it was just perfect. Then he added that she could go now. At that moment, he held a hairpin in his hand, which just so happened to be holding back some of the girl's hair. He tucked it away in his pocket, and turning to Dixie, requested that she run her hand over her cheek as if to wipe away a tear, and ran to her carriage without stopping. Then smiling, he asked, "Can she do it?" But the girl did not understand how he could be at all so unperturbed in such a situation. Dixie. There was nothing left but to put the plan into action, and soon she ran out of the terrace in tears. The guests, when they saw her, were very surprised and excited. They realized that she had just run out of the terrace to which Sir Elliot had just gone, and they must have been all alone. Some made some theories, and others demolished them, saying that they had seen the gentleman go in there immediately after my lady, and said that the two of them had not been seen, and it must have been some secret meeting. One of the guests even noticed that my lady may have been crying, for she was running so fast that it was impossible to see clearly. The guests were shocked, unable to believe that some kind of love had rekindled between the two. Dixie, who was still running and had overheard a glimpse of their conversation, was very surprised. She had not expected that people would start talking about it all at once. Lucius, who at this time continued to remain on the balcony, pulled out of his pocket the hairpin he had removed from the girl's hair and began to scrutinize it. When Lucius first started to approach her, she immediately took a step back. That surprised him very much. He realized that it was completely different the first time. However, on the other hand, it was obvious that she had changed in the meantime, and he was already used to rejection. At that moment, Lucius sat back down at the table that stood on the terrace and thought about how very strange this was all. The sweet, sweet appearance of his lover that day amounted to a brief moment. Still, however, even after all these years, it is this scene that comes to mind every time he thinks of Didrak. It wasn't that he couldn't forgive her, or that he wished for some kind of retribution. It was just that he knew how shy she was, and that they were both young. But when he thinks about all of this, he just feels funny about his feelings and worries about it. Destroying everything can be done with absolutely no labor of any kind. Those words broke something very precious in his soul, because of what he would probably remember them forever. At that moment, the guy went to the balcony and threw her brooch through the window. It fell straight into the bushes. Several days had passed since that ball. However, there were still various rumors going around the town. Now the ladies who were in the garden were discussing the incident with Mr. Elliot and Lady Louiden. At every chance people were discussing this news about the same couple everyone was talking about 6 years ago. That evening, Lady Louidet was conversing with Mr. Elliot on something on the terrace, and then suddenly ran out into the hall and ran away, with tears in her eyes. Others said they had heard that there were no tears, but that they did not really play an important part in the story. They all saw my lady run out of the terrace that Elliot had just entered. They had, after all, parted so tragically due to unforeseen circumstances a long time ago. Many said that it was quite evident that my lady was there begging the gentleman to give her a second chance, since her engagement to Prince Fred had never taken place, and other potential suitors just weren't on her horizon, so she decided to take advantage of the opportunity. One of the ladies said that as far as she knew, Mr. Elliot was also hot. In fact, anything was possible. One of the ladies remembered the last time they met in the free infirmary that my lady was envious of. The conversations didn't really end there. And yes, they were constantly trying to discuss the topic somehow, at every opportunity. At this time, Lucius was sitting in his office as his assistant suddenly walked in and asked him what he would order to be done, if the fire should be lowered. And the man was serious and said it didn't need to be done, and asked that he just leave it as it was for the moment. This made the boy very angry. He was silent for a while, but after that he couldn't stand it and suddenly started shouting at the gentleman. He said it couldn't be tolerated because almost everything people said was a lie, and asked if Lucius knew what kind of talk was going on among them now. And without waiting for an answer, the lad said that many people say there was a terrible tension between them at the ball at Anderson Manor. Others, however, claim that the lady caught him at the Grave Rama, which they frequent, and still others claim that they resumed intercourse even before Prince Fred's demise. People make up different stories all the time about how they, as a young couple, did various things at shows, gardens, and even theaters. The guy summed up by saying that the whole capital is on its ear, and this news, even after such a long time, is not quiet. Better already laughed suddenly and said that he should be thankful that the people themselves had spread so many rumors about them, because there wasn't even a special hint of it, and they had done all the work for him. His assistant looked at him in surprise, then asked if he was really going to marry Lady Louiden. Lucius looked out the window irritably and wondered how many more times he was going to ask the same question. He'd already taken the documents to the duchy, so there was no turning back. The guy suddenly started to turn to him and said that he himself knew that the emperor could step into his position and change his mind. He irritatedly asked, what kind of normal person would choose a life partner by cold calculation? What's more, they have one sad past for both of them. He asked Lucius if he was tired of it all, if he wanted a new life. Then suddenly the man lowered his gaze and said in a calm voice that what had happened then was not Didrach's fault. His assistant, hearing this, was very much surprised. He continued to shout, asking how it was that there was no guilt, for my lady had betrayed his love in a very real way, and as far as he knew, she had not even visited him once then. And he knows for a fact that this is not how people act when they really truly love someone. He calmed down a bit and sighed heavily, saying that after the whole truth came out, it immediately made sense. But then suddenly, Louis turned to Tommy and, smiling, asked him if he was going to talk much longer. At this point, The guy realized that he was a little out of line, and then, lowering his gaze, apologized to his host, saying that he was just being too emotional. Lucius took the papers from the table and asked him to walk already because he didn't need him standing here whining. Tommy replied that he really just knew how fragile his heart was, and the boy doesn't want him to suffer more than anything else in the world. He wanted to say something else to his master, but suddenly a girl came running into the room. She got as close to Lucius as she could and asked if it was true that he was dating Lady Louiden. He saw the girl's stern look and realized that the news had reached her now, and Tommy said he would go, for it was a private conversation. It was his sister Dixie. She looked at her brother in surprise and asked if he really thought she and Mom approved of the marriage. However, Lucius kept his cool and said that whoever he actually chose, Mother would still be against it. Dixie asked in a sad voice if he'd forgotten how his mother had felt about him after what had happened. She just turned her back on him and wouldn't even talk to him. The sister looked at her brother carefully and said that she had finally come to her senses, and he was going to marry that girl just like that. Lucius averted his tired eyes from him and said that he knows Mother has softened a lot since then. However, he also knows that she still won't forgive him ever. No matter how many times he apologized to her, nothing would change, and she would still hold a grudge against him. Dixie suddenly put her head down and said that he didn't really have anything to apologize for. She said it was all really the fault of her father, who never told anyone about anything from the beginning. Lucius then looked at his sister for a while. After that, he suddenly smiled. He realized that his sister apparently really did think that this was just a family misunderstanding that could just be forgotten in time. But in fact, if their family had known the whole truth from the beginning, that public shaming would never have happened. But he still doesn't understand what difference it would have made. Whichever way the truth was floated to the top, it would not change the fact that he is an illegitimate son. So the guy said that even if she thought he wasn't guilty of anything, he would like the same understanding towards Deirdre. He looked at Dixie carefully and said in a stern voice that really what had happened was not all her fault, and she didn't deserve to be treated like that. When his sister heard all this, she was very surprised. She sternly said that love had actually turned his head, and he could not see the truth. She seriously said that because of all this, he couldn't look at things soberly and see the real reason. Dixie was so angry that her whole body was even shaking. But Lucius sat perfectly calm and said that actually no, and Deirdre was exactly the same victim. The guy said she didn't know he was born out of wedlock either, and it makes sense that Dixie had her request denied that day. When the girl heard this, she got even more angry and said with all the hatred in her voice that he had cried so bitterly while lying on the sofa in the library that day. Lucius barely explained through tears that Lady Louiden had left him. He had suffered so much, and now suddenly he was saying he loved her again and was going to marry her after all he had been through, after all the humiliation. Dixie was silent for a while. After that, she said that she understood that he had been hurt, and that was why it was his choice to forgive Milady or not. However, it is still her opinion that this girl will never truly love him. She turned around and started to walk away, saying that she was absolutely certain that for Lady Louiden, only gain was important. However, if her arguments were weightless, then she would no longer discourage him, let him do as he saw fit. And if Lucius is willing to suffer like that again, because there's a good chance that Deirdre could quietly do the same thing again, then that would be his problem. It's his choice. She ended with a glimpse of her brother, and said that she just wanted him to know that this choice would be the stupidest mistake of his life. And with those words, the girl walked out the door. When Lucius was alone, he suddenly began to think through this entire conversation and analyze the phrases that had been said. At this point, Tommy, seeing that his sister had already left, went back into the study and wondered what the lady had said. For from the look on her face, it was very bad. Lucius didn't answer him anything to that. He turned to the side and looked out the window, silent. And so, after some time, he asked his assistant to decorate the garden so that it looked presentable. After that, he got up from the table. When Tommy heard this order, he was very surprised. He asked why he should do it, since the garden was already quite presentable. However, The man firmly said that it was not beautiful enough, and it must be made so that the garden would enthrall the beholder from the very first glance. Tommy still didn't understand what it was for. He remained silent for a while. But then he realized that there was no way out of it, so he said that everything would be done. Some more time passed from that moment, and Dedreish suddenly came to meet Lucius. They walked down the street for a while, and she asked how much longer it would be. The man looked at her in surprise and wondered what exactly she meant. The girl looked him straight in the eye, held his hand, and then asked him when he would finally propose to her. Lucius hadn't expected that, and because of that he squeezed her hand tighter, asking if she really wanted a proposal. Dedreish said that she had heard that the emperor had asked to hurry up with the marriage. However, he has been wasting time for 2 months now and has not taken any steps forward. Lucius smiled and said that the decision was up to them anyway, so he didn't see what the rush was for. Or maybe she suddenly really wanted to marry him. Dedreish at this point heard the laughter of the other ladies behind her and sighed heavily, realizing that they were constantly in full view of everyone, and it was impossible to hide from those stares. Then she turned to Lucius and said that she was sick of breaking comedy in front of people. And at home, too, she couldn't understand what was going on. Every day some relatives come and ask her to leave him. She told me that this morning they were also visiting. One of her aunts asked if she didn't realize how important this time was for her father. And her marriage is her last chance to overcome all her adversity. And she's doing whatever the hell she's doing, like she's acting out a scene in a theater. The aunt looked at her with hatred and asked her when she had become so selfish. Dedreish tried to keep her head straight, but she was still hurt by these words, because she did everything for her father. And when people accuse her of being selfish, the girl chalks it up as her what more. Dedreish lowered her head and said that all her relatives think she is crazy, and she is very tired of it all. She wanted to get married quickly and cut off all ties with them. Lucius looked at her in surprise and asked, "But why did everyone dump absolutely everything on her shoulders? What, if anything, does her father do at this time?" The girl replied that her father had better not interfere in these matters at all, for people would suspect something wrong if he began to stand up for her. They were silent for a while. Lucius turned away from the girl and said that he thought she was right after all. Dedreish looked at him at this point and realized that he probably wasn't particularly interested in the topic. However, it was fascinating to her to see what he had in mind. Then suddenly Lucius looked at her, and seeing the look on her face, asked what she was suddenly looking at. Daedrica became uncomfortable and immediately averted her gaze, saying it was nothing like that. Then she quickly decided to change the topic of conversation so he wouldn't dwell on it. She was about to ask if she had visited him, but suddenly the boy moved closer to her and kissed her gently on the cheek out of the blue. Dedreish, feeling his lips on her cheek, was very surprised. Her hand suddenly began to tremble, and she didn't understand why she was doing it. The girl was about to say something to him when suddenly he pulled back and, laughing, said that she was amazed every time he did that. After that, he pointed somewhere to the side, asking that she look over there. Dedreish looked behind his gaze, and he said that this girl was Madame Santel. Indeed, there was a young girl passing near them, who was very elegantly dressed. But at that moment, the girl became uneasy. She said it was all like a ghost. The boy moved closer to her, and smiling, asked if she meant him or Madame Santel. Dedreish, still red from such an unexpected kiss, asked if he'd rather answer when they finally got married already. They went for a walk down the street, and he told her not to worry, because it would be soon. But she still wanted clear answers, so she asked him when it would be soon. Lucius laughed and said that if he told her the answers, all interest would be lost immediately. Dedreish looked at him irritably, not understanding why he was dragging his feet on this marriage. Then she suggested that perhaps he had a sweetheart whom he did not want to betray by marrying her. She remembers the topic coming up on the floor once, and lately there had even been rumors of them having an affair together with that girl. Everyone present is saying that a girl like Berry Spot would not be the guardian of Lucius's pages. After all, she has a very good-natured character, and she herself probably doesn't mind having contact with him in some way. At that moment, Dedreish suddenly moved closer to him and took his hand, thinking that unlike her, she would certainly not abandon her lover. Then she told Lucius that she didn't think they should drag it out, because this marriage wasn't for love anyway, and the sooner they did it, the sooner everyone would get off their backs. The boy looked at her in surprise and said nothing. There were many different thoughts in his head. But that was the end of their walk, and the girl just went to her home, leaving him alone. When Dixie arrived at her estate, she went at once to the statue and, sitting down in a special posture, began to pray. At that moment, the girl was suddenly reminded of one not-so-pleasant memory. She had once visited her mother, who had asked her daughter for help, not understanding why she was just looking at her pain. The woman said that she had a special power too, after all, and didn't understand if she just enjoyed watching her mother suffer. Dixie didn't know what to say to that. Her mother held her trembling hands and looked her suffering gaze straight into her eyes. The mother suddenly said that she had gained her powers because the woman had gotten closer to God, and she didn't understand why the girl didn't use them on her, why she was doing this to her, and making her endure all this pain. It was unbearably painful for Dixie to watch her mother suffer. However, the girl suddenly said that she didn't want to suffer anymore. Her mom was very surprised to hear this. She didn't understand what her daughter meant or what it could even mean. The girl explained that her power was actually incomplete, and she could help her, of course. However, in that case, all of her mother's pain would go to her. In fact, when Dixie was very young, she had the power to help her mother get rid of the suffering that her illness caused her. However, at times like this, the girl took all that pain into her body and felt it more strongly than ever. At this point, the girl suddenly let go of her mother's hands and said angrily, knowing full well that she was in incredible pain as she treated her. Her mom looked at her daughter in surprise. She could not believe that Dixie was really saying those words. In fact, the girls were very similar to each other, but her mother had a very tired face because of her illness. Dixie herself could not believe she was saying those words. She told her mother, however, that despite her deficiency, the priests had always praised her abilities. However, ever since she was a child, she had lived with the feeling that she was simply being exploited for something. At this point, the girl got even more angry and started screaming, asking her mother if she could at least be patient this time. The girl sat back in her chair and said that she was going to die pretty soon anyway, so it didn't make any difference. When Dixie finished praying in the temple, she opened her eyes. It always became very hard for her when she remembered these moments. However, there was nothing left for her. More she had to move on. When the girl came out of the temple, she saw two ladies near the door who were discussing something very vigorously. One of the girls asked if they had heard that Eva Wei had turned out to be Count Mendez's mistress. Dixie walked on, but she could still hear their conversation. Her friend was very surprised and asked if the girl was really a mistress. Everyone thought that Count Mendez was a model family man. The narrator said that's what she's talking about. The countess was now at a loss for words. Then the girl was even more surprised and asked how the truth had come out.